to meeting number 43 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. The webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 2nd, 2021, the committee will resume its study of the impact of COVID-19 on seniors. Would like to welcome our witnesses to begin our discussion with 5 minutes of opening remarks, followed by questions. We have with us today Mary Oko, the Chair of the Family Council of Copernicus Lodge, and from the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, Kathy Majowski, Board Chair and Registered Nurse. For the benefit of our witnesses, I'd like to make just a couple of additional comments. Interpretation is available in this video conference. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, mic should be on mute. And you may notice when you at each round of questions, when the MP starts to get to the end of their turn, I'll hold up one finger to indicate 1 minute left. Don't panic. You'll have a chance to finish your thought, and a minute is actually quite a long time. So with that, we're going to start with Ms. Oko for 5 minutes. So welcome to the committee. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Distinguished members of HUMA, thank you for allowing me to participate in this valuable work that this committee has been tasked to undertake. As you know, I'm Mary Oko. I'm appearing before you today as a family member whose mom is currently at Copernicus Lodge, a long-term care home located in Toronto, Ontario. I am also the chair of the Family Council, representing the families who have loved ones living in the home. My mom, Wanda Oko, is 95 years old with advanced dementia. I come before you to share how my mom and I were impacted by COVID and how I think we can make things better for our seniors moving forward. Some background. During wave 1, my mom's home was fortunate not to have any COVID outbreaks. During wave 2, my mom's home was hit pretty hard. 22 residents died of COVID, 100 of 200 residents and 85 of 300 staff were infected. Many residents are still suffering. Their health has declined. Many who were once walking and independent now need walkers, wheelchairs, or are bedridden. My mom is one such casualty. Before the lockdown, she was walking. Now she is bedridden, and during the lockdown, she developed a stage 4 bed sore on her tailbone, the size of a golf ball that will likely never heal. She didn't get COVID, however, she suffered due to the lockdown and other restrictions implemented under the guise of keeping residents safe. Today, I will share 3 concerns that have deeply affected me and my mom. The first one, insufficient staff support for my mom. My mom has lived in long-term care for 9 years. Because of poor supports provided, I felt compelled to hire at my own expense a care assistant who helped her with mental stimulation, exercise, feeding, and some outdoor excursions. In addition, I visited her twice per week to help with these and other activities such as dressing and hygiene. Without this added support, my mom would not have continued walking or maintained mental engagement. When COVID hit, my mom's care assistant and I were locked out of the home. When I was allowed back into the home in September 2020, my mom had declined because our extra care was not available. She had stopped talking and she was less engaged. During wave 2 lockdown, she received no access to exercise and was not able to leave her room. My mom is now bedridden and needs the assistance of a lift to move her from bed to wheelchair. Assistance with feeding has always been an area where staff shortages are most obvious. Prior to COVID, my care assistant and I helped with my mom's feeding. During wave 2 lockout, staff shortages and a lack of family support resulted in my mom poorly eating and a decline in her overall well-being. Second point, my care as a caregiver for my mom was not considered. Given there is a lack of staff to provide the level of care tailored for each resident, the staff always welcomed my help when it came to see my mom. They also valued that I could quickly identify issues that needed the attention of staff or in some cases needed to be escalated to the doctor. When COVID hit, I, like many families across Canada, were shut out. I was reduced to video meetings where my mom didn't acknowledge my presence, as she is better when I'm holding her hand and talking to her. During wave 2, when families were once again locked out and in the midst of our outbreak, as I mentioned earlier, my mom developed a serious bed sore. Pre-COVID lockdowns and restrictions, I would have had access to my mom and worked with the staff in addressing any issues she had. Families were not allowed to help when the home badly needed our support. Lastly, my mom and I, as her power of attorney, were not properly consulted in decisions that impact my mom. We consider Copernicus my mom's home, not just an institution. Since my mom has advanced dementia, I have always been involved in the discussions and decisions relating to the level of care provided to her. COVID changed this, especially during wave 2. My mom and I, as her power of attorney, were not included in some of the decisions that were being made that impacted her level of care. As an example, on December 14th, from 2 residents who tested positive for COVID on my mom's floor, then 9, again, mostly on my mom's floor, this led to a decision to confine over 200 residents to their room 24/7, many in areas where no active cases existed. This decision was made based on meetings held between Toronto Public Health, Ministry of Long-Term Care, Unity Health, the hospital who is partnered with our home, and the Copernicus management team. Residents and families of residents being impacted by such decisions were not given a voice at these meetings. Any other patient in our healthcare system is given the benefit of consultation and decisions that impact their health. During COVID, as it relates to COVID, no such consideration is given to seniors living in long-term care or their power of attorney. Why is this considered acceptable? So how do we fix this? Here are my 4 suggestions. First, national standards for long-term care. Comparing what was happening in my mom's home with other long-term care homes in Toronto or from other provinces, I note there is a lack of consistency in how our seniors are cared for in many areas, including staffing levels, COVID testing, and IPAC controls. No senior should ever feel they are discriminated against based on the city, town they live in, the province or territory, or the type of home they choose to live in. We are all Canadians, and our seniors should be treated fairly and equitably from coast to coast to coast. Second, never lock out families. Families serve an integral role in the level of care provided to our seniors. We know our loved ones, and we can and do work with the homes to provide the quality of care our loved ones need. Until adequate staffing levels are addressed and funded, it is essential that families not be denied the right to improve the quality of care and indeed the quality of palliative care of our loved ones who live in long-term care. My mom and our seniors will always need their family for love and support. Third, raise the profile of family council. During COVID, Family Council at Copernicus Lodge was a strong voice speaking for the residents. Family Council pushed for the resumption of regular bathing and showering, demanded increases in mental stimulation and activities, and so much more. But Family Council members are unpaid volunteers, and it is a real challenge to attract and retain members, especially when we are not listened to by well-paid management and healthcare agencies. Lastly, resident voice at the table. In any discussions that impact the health and well-being of the residents, their voice and/or their power of attorney who represents the resident needs to be included. I beg you to never silence my mom's voice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Oko. Next, we're going to go to Ms. Majowski. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Ms. Oko for sharing your experiences. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Nehiyawik, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and in the heart of the Métis Nation. The Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse is a national nonprofit organization made up of individuals and organizations who care about older adults and the prevention of harm in later life. Elder abuse has long been nicknamed the silent pandemic. It was rampant in our communities long before COVID. Like gender-based violence, it flared under COVID and emerged as a shadow pandemic in 2020. We all experienced the stress and impact of the pandemic. What helped many of us rise to the challenge every day was a supportive family or social group. For many older Canadians, these crucial bonds were obliterated by the pandemic. The necessity to stay home and socially distance whittled away opportunities for social interactions and access to core services. During the first few months of the pandemic, we ran a survey to evaluate the immediate impact of COVID-19 on our members. We asked elder abuse prevention folks and senior service providers what they were experiencing and observing. When asked about the impact on the seniors they served, respondents listed increase in elder abuse and domestic violence as the #1 issue, followed closely by decreased access to services and supports and increase in social isolation. Social isolation is a serious public health risk with life-threatening consequences, and it can be as damaging to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It incurs negative health behaviors and decreased mental health, and it's also a risk factor for elder abuse, neglect, and self-neglect. An isolated older adult may lack access to necessities, be more vulnerable to scammers, and be trapped at home with their abuser with no access to supports. Almost 65% of our survey respondents reported the impact of COVID-19 on their program and operations as high, with 83% reporting a disruption of services to clients. 46% reported an increased demand for services. This was the perfect storm. Increasingly isolated older adults in greater need of support services that were highly disrupted by the pandemic. Social distancing became a double-edged sword. We all know what followed. Older adults living at home reported higher rates of isolation and mental health struggles. The Senior Safety Line in Ontario reported a 250% increase in calls about elder abuse. And meanwhile, in some long-term care homes, residents endured appalling abuse and neglect. The past year was a stress test that exposed the weaknesses in our system. Older Canadians have borne the brunt of this pandemic through deaths, isolation, and decreased safety and quality of life, and they're not willing to be sacrificed and ignored anymore. Around 90% of older Canadians live at home, and most of us hope to age in place. For this to happen safely, we need to be addressing abuse and neglect in our communities. Our recommendations include improved training and education programs across sectors. By providing adequate care for older adults in their homes and communities, we need to be focused not only on making sure that there are enough human resources to complete the assigned tasks. Older adults should also have a network of supports and community services that work well together and are trained and educated in recognizing ageism, in elder abuse awareness and prevention, and are familiar with the local, regional, and national resources available. The training needs to be trauma and violence informed, with equity orientation to act as a bridge across sectors and mandates for a more inclusive and collaborative approach to prevention and response. We also recommend encouraging the development of age-friendly communities and ensuring that that effort has an elder abuse prevention lens. We know that personal support workers, also known as healthcare aides, have the most consistent and frequent contact with older adults receiving support in their homes and have inconsistent levels of education, training, and oversight. Regulation of this role would increase protection for the public through professional responsibilities, would have minimum standards for entry to practice, and processes in place for responding to complaints. It would also increase safety by verifying qualifications and competencies for safe practice via a public registry and complaint information similar to other regulatory bodies. A key element would be minimum educational requirements and standardization of educational programs, including trauma-informed care, dementia care, and elder abuse awareness, prevention, and response, including information about the reporting process if there is suspicion of elder abuse. This would also foster safety and stability for these professionals who are often women from racialized communities who are themselves more vulnerable. We recommend providing sustained and appropriate funding for the elder abuse and neglect response sector on par with domestic violence funding. Particularly provide dedicated support and funding to the CNPEA to ensure that there is a national organization dedicated to elder abuse prevention and awareness that will foster the exchange of reliable information among stakeholders and service providers across Canada. And finally, we would recommend establishing a federal office of seniors advocate. It should provide systemic oversight and leadership on issues related to the current needs of Canadian seniors, as well as provide insight, analysis, and direction to the government on the future needs of our aging population. Elder abuse and neglect awareness and response should be a key and ongoing mandate of this office. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Majowski. We're going to start now with rounds of questions, beginning with Ms. Falk, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I would like to thank both of our witnesses for your contributions to our study today as we look to better support Canada's seniors as we navigate beyond this pandemic. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored and exacerbated shortcomings in our long-term care homes. And unfortunately, it is our seniors who have paid the highest price for these shortcomings. And regardless of where they live, every senior has the right to age and dignity, and every level of government has a responsibility to take action. Ms. Mary Oko, I want to thank you for your vulnerability and your willingness to advocate on behalf of your mother and ultimately all seniors. I know myself, I don't want to see an Ottawa knows best approach when it comes to national standards. And Ms. Oko, I'm just wondering how important you would think or believe it would be to not only have the provinces and the territories be at the table when it comes to discussion of national standards, but also to have frontline workers, seniors advocates, and caregiving organizations.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. So in response to that question, I feel that it has to be a collaborative approach, that you need to have many people at the table, and definitely frontline workers. Here in Ontario, we have a very strong, the Registered Nurses Association, who's been a very strong advocate and proponent for the type of the quality of care that residents should be having. So having individuals like that, advocacy groups, but also definitely having representation from the residents and families for those who cannot speak for themselves should also be at the table. And I agree that what I'm proposing in terms of national standards, it does touch upon what Kathy was referring to, because my idea is, regardless of the type of home a senior chooses to live in, long-term care is just one option of many.
Mm-hmm.
But there should be consistency across the country. And it's been very frustrating for myself and many families, and I have friends in other parts of Canada, when we compare notes, how disparate the quality of care is for our seniors. It was almost feeling like we're in 13 different countries instead of one country.
Yeah, and I do want to make a note of your remarks. You made mention of families and how important it is to not shut them out. And from my background and my experience, having worked in a medical facility when it comes to people that are being hospitalized, I know how important it is to not fall into that institutionalization lull, right? And it's something that you referred to even with your mother, not having that constant stimulation every day. And I think what's so important is how much our families do in the caregiving role, and not even just actively doing, but advocating. Family members and close friends, the ones that go and visit loved ones, are the biggest advocates, and sometimes the loudest voices. So I just wanted to make note that I think that's really important and valid to mention. And I guess just talking about staffing, I know in my role as Shadow Minister for Seniors, I've heard a lot of testimony on staffing shortages. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, how has staffing shortages impacted the quality of care that you've seen specifically for seniors in long-term care homes?
Well, the biggest example is the fact that my mom has a stage 4 bed sore, because when it happened, it was in 3 weeks while the families were being locked out. The home and the various people at the table knew that we had a shortage of specifically registered nurses. And so it wasn't like miraculously 200 people are in their rooms and we have a huge contingent of extra staff to help provide that level of care for each of these residents. They had to make do with the staffing levels that we had, even with the use of agency staff. But the problem with having agency staff is that they don't know the residents very well.
Absolutely.
So
there's a rapport with that, right? When you have that relationship,
exactly.
You know what they like, what they don't like, how to communicate, and that goes a long way.
Yes. And so what I feel is a lot of my advocacy is not to attack the staff. The staff have done the best that they can, but they're in a no-win situation. Because of the funding levels, the staffing ratios, it is completely inadequate to provide the level of care that our seniors need, especially in long-term care, where many of the average age is 80, many of them have dementia, and they need specific types of care.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is where I'm leery too. I know the government has talked about bringing in new penalties for caregivers, and this is where I'm I'm not okay with, because if we have residents that live in a home and there just isn't the capacity, there's the staffing shortages, I don't think it's okay to penalize somebody because they just physically cannot do the workload. There clearly is a staffing issue. I just wanted to make a note about the mental health too. I'm just wondering if you could share at all in your experience how you've witnessed seniors being impacted, their mental health being impacted, living in long-term care throughout this pandemic.
Well, again, my mom was engaged and she was talking. She's not talking. And many of the other residents, it was disheartening to watch those who are mobile and conversive, who they're less than they were. They need now assistance feeding. They need to be engaged, or they can't engage. And you try to talk to them, they're confused, because they were also getting mixed messages. During the lockdown in my mom's home, a lot of the residents were kept in their rooms 24/7. So even the ones who tried to get out of their room were constantly being told and pushed back into their room. So then once things started stabilizing and the residents were allowed to go out, they were petrified. They stayed in their rooms. And then the staff would turn around and say, well, the residents don't want to come out. They've been trained not to come out. They've had so many negative messages that now they stay in their room, but that just increases their isolation and their decline.
Thank you, Ms. Oko and Ms. Falk. Next, we're going to go to Ms. Young, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much to both of our witnesses today. A gripping testimony, especially Ms. Oko, hearing about your experiences with your mother and what she has gone through. And as watching my father, he died in a long-term care facility 8 years ago, before COVID, of course. And knowing the challenges that he faced in a long-term care facility even that long ago, and things have only got worse, and certainly worse through COVID, I really do feel for you and can't imagine what it must have been like. I know you talked about you wanted to raise the profile of families and this idea of having a family council for people to listen to the concerns of the residents. Do you think that should be regulated as a part of long-term care standards, that is needed, or is that something that the residents' families themselves really have to push for?
Thank you. So in response to that question, Mr. Chair, I feel it needs to be regulated. In Ontario, it is part of the Long-Term Care Act. However, in BC, I have friends in BC, there is no such act and there is no such thing as family council. And what families have had to do, my friends included, was they had to come together and create their own quasi-family council groups through Facebook. And so families were connecting families from families to provide support and to provide shared resources. But even in Ontario, where it's regulated, the area of family council is not always respected within every single home. There are some homes who work very well with family council, and then there are some homes that do not want to work with family council because they feel that they don't understand it. They feel that it's just extra work. They feel that they're doing what they need to do to take care of the residents. But again, the majority of the residents who are in long-term care have some form of dementia or cognitive disability. So even though many of the homes have a residents' council, they cannot effectively communicate on behalf of themselves because they're in fear that if they speak out too negatively, there will be ramifications imposed against them. I have families within my own family council who are afraid to speak out because they feel that the quality of care that their loved one will be getting will be declined.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Oko. I think you are hopefully very pleased that our government recently launched a consultation to define seniors abuse so that they can understand it properly and come up with better legislation. If I can go to Ms. Majewski for a moment, seniors, of course, we know can experience abuse, elder abuse, in any facility, long-term care facility, hospital. They can, while they're shopping, even in their own home. I just wondered if you, in your opinion, what steps can be taken to improve the reporting of abuse among seniors?
Thank you very much for the question. Reporting is a very tricky conversation, because we do want to keep in mind that, first of all, 91% of our older adults live in the community. So they are being supported in the community. And the abuse that they experience, in many cases, we know that the perpetrators are people that are close to them, whether it be a neighbor, a friend, a family member that's providing some sort of caregiving roles, or is even with the person. So reporting is a very delicate conversation. I would say it's on par with domestic violence reporting. Sometimes when health workers take on the responsibility, or social services workers, community services workers take on the responsibility of mandatory reporting, we're actually going against what the older adult would want. There's many reasons that they don't want to report. Some of them may be that they don't want their family member to get in trouble, to experience legal ramifications for the behavior. Sometimes it's because they do feel some guilt. We look at it as a bit of a harm reduction scenario, where if we can put additional supports into place that can take some of the strain, or the them having to depend on the abuser, then in many cases that can improve the situation. It is important to consider, talk about reporting. Older adults are just as capable as younger adults to decide what's best for their lives, and they may have different ideas of what kind of behavior is acceptable. So we need to meet them where they're at and understand that, we might have really wonderful ideas on how we can significantly improve the situation for them, but if it's not something that the person wants, then it's really going to contradict quality of life and happiness, safety and security. So elder abuse prevention is a very convoluted and nuanced conversation, particularly when we're talking about people that are living in the community. Long-term care, for example, the conversation is much different. It is a much more structured environment. There are definitely ways that the reporting can be made a little bit more standardized. And it's different across the country, unfortunately. Provinces and territories all have different models. So families and staff should be aware of what resources are available for their facility. But in the community, it's a much more complicated conversation.
Thank you very much. You've answered my next question, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Suite, Madame Chabot.
And now Ms. Chabot for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Since the beginning of our deliberations, and even before we began discussing the reality of seniors in the HUMA committee, in the case of the worst part of the situation during the pandemic, but in some situations it was before the pandemic, and we can discuss in a general sense the situation of our seniors financially and from a health point of view, etc. And the situation that you described for yourself and your mother, Ms. Oko, unfortunately, it is a situation that many seniors have experienced in the institutional setting. In Quebec, it has also been the case in certain institutions. Unfortunately, I wouldn't well, I wouldn't put everyone in our public institutions for the healthcare for seniors. I wouldn't put everyone in the same boat, because there have also been positive examples and good practices in terms of what happened with us. But what happened was quite negative, and each province took measures as best they could. Sometimes it was quite difficult for our seniors, for their loved ones and families. And you're quite right to say that the isolation that occurred when we had to take measures to ensure that seniors were protected by preventing their loved ones to come into the setting, it had various effects. So thank you for that testimony, even though it's very difficult because it's a testimony that applies throughout Canada from one system to another. But on the other hand, I am skeptical, with all due respect, as regards a solution that you seem to be putting forward, namely national standards that would come from Ottawa to regulate ultimately what is being done in each province. I could cite examples in Quebec of the numerous standards that we have for our institutions and in the way care is organized. These are choices in terms of the ratios of staff to patients. I don't think that we can make wall-to-wall policies on that. So it appears to me very difficult to think that that would solve the situation. But there is one thing that we find important, because you talked about underfinancing when you talked about the staffing. So it's the underfinancing for the provinces which have the skill to organize the care. It's because Ottawa has to do its share. It has to do its part, and whether it's the government of Ontario or the government in Quebec, there's one thing that they want to ask of the federal government, which is to significantly increase the health transfers so that the share of expenses corresponds to the province's needs in providing these services. What do you think about, well, let's say, that approach of the Ontario government, that of Quebec and other governments, as to Ottawa that needs to do its fair share and do a greater share?
Thank you for that question, and Mr. Chair. So when I made the suggestion about national standards for long-term care, my point was not that Ottawa would be dictating the quality of standards that would be imposed for each of the provinces. What I feel is that, yes, the federal government has an obligation to provide funding to each of the provinces, but they should also be working with each of the provinces, and why not use the best of what has worked in each of the provinces for the benefit of all Canadians who are living across Canada. Because to your point, it is very different. For example, as an example, right now, I can go and see my mom, but I need to take a PCR test weekly, and I've had to do this since August. I'm fully vaccinated. My mom is fully vaccinated. In addition to the PCR test, I also have to do a rapid test. In Quebec, and then once I'm in the home, I have to wear a surgical mask and a face shield. In Quebec, based on friends that I've spoken to, there is no need to do a PCR test. There's no need to do a rapid test. All they have to do is wear just full PPEs. In BC, they don't have to do a rapid test or a PCR test. And the only thing that they have to wear is a surgical mask. So why is there a difference? I'm at a point where throughout this pandemic, if I could, I would have moved my mom from province to province, depending on what was going and working best for those seniors at that time. But why should I be in that situation? And why should families be put in that situation? We care, we love our loved one. We want them to have the best quality of care. And I feel that the provinces cannot expect to have a blank check where funding is provided to them and that without any kind of strings attached. each of you are representing our various provinces, and I feel that each of you working as leaders can work with our provinces to try to find a solution that will be equitable and fair for all of our seniors across the country.
Thank you, Ms. Oko. Merci, Madame Chabot.
Thank you, Ms. Chabot.
And please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. And first, I'd like to start out by commending Madame Oko for your strength and sharing the story about caring for your parents. I as well looked after my parents when they were both sick many years ago, and the kind of toll it takes trying to make sure that your parents have care that really allows them to live in dignity. So thank you so much for sharing your story, and for Madame Majowski, you as well for your tremendous knowledge and work. And my first question is actually for you. For years, advocates in the disability community, including seniors, have advocated for better supports for disabled persons so that they can live with dignity. Unfortunately, from my opinion, I don't think the rights of disabled persons was a priority for this government or previous governments before the pandemic or during the pandemic. And today, the day before the House rises and we're adjourning for summer, we have a potential election in the fall. Finally, this government introduced legislation to create a Canada Disability Benefit known as Bill C-35, something that, I hope sees the light of day, but I'm not very hopeful. To me, this piece of legislation should have been a top priority if we look at, some of the statistics that we've witnessed during the pandemic. I'm wondering if you can speak about how both persons with disabilities and disabled seniors in particular have been disproportionately impacted during the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm going to speak a little bit from my day job role. I'm actually, I am a registered nurse and I work in the core area of Winnipeg. And we see on a daily basis how underserved our older adults are. Those are my clients. Those are the people that I support. We know that people fare better in our system with supports from family, friends, others advocating for them. But there's a large swath of individuals who are both disabled and older adults who don't have those folks advocating for them, and they're really left to their own devices. So they're missing out on core services and finances and funding available to them. Sometimes it's available to them because they're not able to navigate the system and they don't have the community supports that they need to be able to do that. So that's where our program actually comes in and tries to fill in the gaps, but it's not enough, and it hasn't been enough for years. People with disabilities who also live in poverty, people with disabilities who are over 55 or 65, the communities are not set up to support them. The communities, there are actually more barriers than supports in place. They're regularly hearing no. And after a lifetime of hearing no, or you don't qualify, or you're not eligible, it gets very disheartening. And when it comes to what we've seen in the last year with the pandemic, many of the consistent services that had been in place for these folks disappeared. And now we have individuals that are still living in poverty, still have disabilities, still older adults and higher risk if they do contract COVID, without access to technology, without access to phones. Some of the services are only available with technology. Our province has a wonderful counseling program that they launched and that they funded really early on in the pandemic, recognizing that mental health concerns are very real concerns. Many of our clients had no ability to access it. They don't have the skills to use technology. They don't have the funding to be able to. So we see those gaps are significant, and they've widened with the decrease in services.
So just going back to the question of poverty, so 2012 Statistics Canada reported that 12.1% of older Canadians are living at a low income. And by 2016, it actually increased to 14.5. To your point, that seniors we're not taking better care of our seniors. In fact, they're going into deeper levels of poverty. And on top of that, the pandemic also revealed the extent to which Canada forces seniors into vulnerable and unliving conditions. I present this question to both of you. Just a question. I put forward a motion for a guaranteed livable basic income. How do you think this would benefit seniors?
If I may, Ms. Oko, I think that this is huge in the community. We learned, or we were told that $2,000 a month was the minimum amount that people needed to survive in Canada throughout the pandemic, and many of our older adults and people living with disabilities, and older adults living with disabilities are expected to live on much less than that a month. They have to make concessions when it comes to the housing that they choose, the services that are available to them, the food that they're able to purchase. Is dependent on, what's at the corner store, because they don't have transportation to get to a grocery store. Like, there are just the challenges just compound as we get older, and our older adults that are also living in poverty are much more impacted, with much more barriers put in front of them. It's the guaranteed basic income would make a massive difference, would allow them to feel comfortable finally.
Thank you, Ms. Majewski. Thank you, Ms. Gazan. Next, Ms. Doncho, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I found it very heartfelt, and you could tell this is something that's very personal and a passion of yours to pursue better, dignified care that's compassionate and considerate for those in long-term care. And obviously this year we've seen there's an incredible need. I really feel like it's lifted the veil for Canadians to see how our are with home care, which I know Ms. Majewski, you touched on, or Ms. Oko in long-term care. So I have a question for each of you. So first, Ms. Oko, you've touched on this in some other of the questions today, but you talked about the isolation and the impact on your mother's health. And we had heard in previous testimony as well a similar thing, that there's one witness had told us that there is a measurable decline in physical and mental ability for seniors in long-term care after prolonged isolation. And I really appreciate how you laid out your remarks. There was the 3 problems and the 4 solutions. That was excellent. But for the purposes of my question, could you outline a little bit in brief, just further, that it was your experience that you did see grave impacts from that isolation and a potential solution to that?
Well, thank you for that question. So in the case of my mom was somewhat engaged. She did talk when she would, when music was being played, she would readily clap her hands, and not that she understood what was going on, but there's just the energy. Now, when I visit with her, she sleeps most of the time. And so when she is awake, I can't get her to talk to me, or when I play music, she's just lying in bed. She's not engaged. I play act, I have musical instruments, I play YouTube clips, the polka music consistently while I'm dancing around the room. I can't get anything out of her. And so this is just 5 months of isolation. And I have good days and bad days. And a lot of days, unfortunately, there is bad, where I'm there for maybe 6-7 hours and she's awake maybe for an hour.
Wow.
So, and this was a woman who was walking with a walker in December.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I certainly took quite a few notes in your remarks, and we'll further reflect on the recommendations. I thought you made some very strong ones, and I'm sorry that you're dealing with this in your family. And I can appreciate the polka music. My grandparents greatly like polka music as well. So again, thank you for what you're doing for your mom. I wish everyone had advocates like you are for your mother. And Ms. Majewski, you did touch on home care. I did want to ask you your perspective on something I'd read recently. A man named Andre Picard has written extensively about long-term care, and he is proposing that the Dutch model may be a solution to some of the issues we're facing with long-term or home care at home. And recently my grandfather passed away, and we tried really hard to keep him at home, as was his request, but also so that he wasn't isolated at a hospital or home care, in long-term care, but we saw so many different home care workers who'd come in for 15 minutes, often engage in very intimate activity with cleaning or changing. It's just very difficult for an individual who's thus far, until this point, been completely autonomous. And I just thought the Dutch model, which provides where they come in, they sit down, they have coffee with the resident, they spend a couple hours there, they get to know the community and the other residents. I just thought it was an interesting idea, seeing it firsthand. I would love your perspective on that.
Oh, absolutely. So I've witnessed personally working in the community, less and less time available for frontline staff to interact with people, and we've seen pushback from those same frontline staff saying, we can't, yes, in an ideal world we can prepare a meal in 10 minutes, but what about the client that needs to talk about something? What if there is a crisis going on? Way too many of our clients are hearing things like, I'm sorry, I just don't have time. If I sit with you, I'm late for the next person. Those significant time constraints in the community are really robbing the people that are receiving services from real connection. So it sounds like, your grandfather did have family supports around him, and that's wonderful. But we do know that many people that are receiving home care, that is their only contact with the outside world. And if it's somebody coming in and doing very, very intimate care over a 10-minute period, maybe not even having time to introduce themselves or explain what they're going to do, because they're so worried about getting it in that period of time, that they don't have that connection, they don't have that contact, and it can actually feel very, very uncomfortable for the individual receiving care. I support the Dutch model. I support extending time available for frontline staff who are caring for individuals in the community.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you.
And thank you. Next, Mr. Turnbull, please, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to split my time with MP Vaughan. Ms. Oko, I want to echo the comments from my other colleagues about your testimony today. It's really emotional. I actually very much relate to it on an emotional level, because it's very similar to the story of my own mother, who's in long-term care as well. I just wanted to ask you, I know you've been advocating for your mother, and I know that that's something that many family members have to do. I guess one reflection I have on this constantly is that in a system of care where you as a person who needs care relies on an outside, someone else, to advocate for you in order to get the quality of care you need, that seems like a key indicator of a broken system. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. I'm advocating for my mom, but I'm also advocating for all the other residents. And my fear is, because of privacy issues, confidentiality, whenever I'm dealing with the home or with the healthcare providers or the hospital, I can never talk about someone else because of confidentiality issues. It always has to be related to my mom. And even when I filed a complaint with the ministry, I raised concerns that existed for other residents, but unless it was impacting my mom specifically, they couldn't address it. And so that's my biggest fear, because I myself do not have children, and I do not have an advocate who will be advocating for me when the time comes that I need long-term care or assistance in a long-term care facility.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Ms. Majowski, if I said it correctly, quick question for you. In terms of, you mentioned the survey that you did and the large incidence of the number of people reporting increased elder abuse during the pandemic. What kind of elder abuse specifically are you seeing? Social, financial, neglect, physical abuse? Can you describe a little bit the trends that you were seeing?
So I would be happy to provide a report of our survey. We put out the survey to our members, so our network, which includes frontline service providers, researchers in the field from across the country. So off the top of my head, I don't know if we broke it down that specifically. It's elder abuse. I understand that there are different levels and different kinds of elder abuse, but the bottom line is, when we have our frontline senior service providers saying that they're seeing an increase, that's just the information that we're going with.
Okay, that's fair. So I'll give the rest of my time over to MP Vaughan.
Mr. Vaughan, please.
Thank you, and I share the whole committee's appreciation for the personal testimonies as well as the emotional impact they've had. Clearly, to Mary Oko, to Ms. Oko, you talked about national standards, but you also seem to talk about those standards not coming from Ottawa, but being supported by Ottawa as a condition of funding. In other words, they come from frontline workers and they come from families and lived experience, but they're married to funding that Ottawa then distributed to province. Is that the system you're advocating?
Yes, because I feel that no one person is the recipient of the best ideas. I feel that it has to be a collaborative effort. So the federal level, the provinces, the municipalities, the stakeholders, the advocates, the families coming together and working together collaboratively in terms of a standard that would make funding perspective and a resource perspective that is doable across Canada from coast to coast to coast.
Is that partly driven from your experience of watching federal funding being invested into long-term care in Ontario, but the situation actually not improving over the summer, and during the second wave, it actually intensified some of the shortcomings? So money wasn't the solution. It was also systems change that needed to be put in place. Is that part of where that observation comes from?
Well, yes. And also just from the conversations that I've had with friends primarily in Quebec and BC, and comparing notes in terms of what was being done in those provinces. But I'm sure if I started speaking to families from other provinces, we'd see disparity as well. And, even within the same city of Toronto, when we were in the thick of an outbreak, our home was testing the staff every 5 days for COVID. Another home, which was in an outbreak, was only testing the staff every 3 days. Same city, same public health, same Ministry of Long-Term Care, and yet just why is that happening? And we families were never given a proper answer to that.
Thank you, Ms. Oko. Sorry, Mr. Vaughan, that's your time. I know it goes by quick.
No worries. Thank you.
Madame Chabot pour
Ms. Chabot, you have 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you. I would like to talk about elder abuse, which is a subject that is a glaring problem for our seniors in Quebec. And I could say that even prior to the pandemic, there's a policy now on elder abuse that also protects what we call not the whistleblowers, but the staff when they report certain situations. And elder abuse has been given a definition, but I would like to focus more on financial abuse. What would be the role when it comes to fraud or financial abuse, which could be better handled?
What would be the role for reporting? I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly.
Well, what I mean is each province probably has its own policies to handle these issues. So when we talk about financial fraud, the federal could play a role. Is there something that could be reinforced?
Yes, absolutely. The dependence on the financial abuser. So frauds and scams, those regulations, that abuse is coming from individuals who are strangers or who are in various sectors that are the scammers. The financial abuse is somebody that's close to the older adult that they're abusing. So again, neighbor, family, friend. From a federal level, I think that awareness is key. Many individuals don't necessarily know that they're being abused. They're being told that they owe this person the money, or they're paying them for services. They've handed over their bank card or their credit card, or they've given a power of attorney. So awareness of their rights would go a long way to helping individuals realize that the way they're being treated and the way that their money is being taken from them is not right and needs to stop.
Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Chabot.
Next, Ms. Gazan, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. My question is for Madame Oko. The certainly the pandemic has shone a light on the glaring inequities and inequalities in this country, and certainly targeted inequalities. And I would say that seniors are one of the groups that have been targeted or ignored even prior to the pandemic. And had we ensured that seniors lived in dignity, we wouldn't have been finding ourselves in this situation in the first place. I think it relates to ageism and the idea that when you reach a certain age, you are no longer of value. Kind of ideas that are associated with the concept of working, when you're no longer working full time and then you lose your value. I was really touched by the story you were telling about caring for your mom. And things like, COVID-19 isn't too dangerous because it's just impacting older people. I mean, we heard that a lot, shocking things like that. Can you speak about how ageism played a role in the responses to COVID-19 and how it's impacted many of the seniors that you're talking about today?
It's definitely an ageism issue. And I would also add to that a gender issue, because the majority of residents who are in long-term care are predominantly women. The majority of healthcare providers who work in a long-term care system are predominantly women, and also racialized women or newcomers. So in terms of ageism, just from would be raising or escalating issues. Like I had many, unfortunately, discussions with the Ministry of Long-Term Care and the media and, and with many people. And it just felt that people just don't care. In terms of, I would be giving them detailed accounts of what was going on in the homes. And it always felt that my mom and the residents were being punished because they were living too long. And then even after the outbreak, with her having the bed sore, some of the discussions that I've had is, well, my mom is frail, she's got advanced dementia, this is to be expected. Yes, it's to be expected that she has advanced dementia and that she will decline, but not to have a stage 4 bed sore and not to have declined in 5 months' time. And these are the kind of conversations that I've had with many families within my home and in other homes as well, where the resident has declined to the point where now they're not eating well, they're struggling, they need to be assisted with eating. And the conversation is always, well, they're at that age, it's dementia. There's always some kind of an excuse. But what I feel is that each person should be treated with dignity and have a quality of life and a quality of death. And that each day should be a day of joy until that point when they are no longer living. We shouldn't be discriminating based on their age. And I've had even a conversation with a doctor who said that in some cases, age discrimination goes to somebody in their 60s. Well, I'm sorry, but I feel that somebody in their 60s is still a young person with a lot of value. So who gets to decide? I think no one should be making that decision as to making a judgment in terms of the quality of care that person is getting.
Thank you very much, Ms. Oko. Thank you, Ms. Gazan. That concludes the questions for this panel of witnesses. I just want to say to each of you, Ms. Oko, your testimony touched and moved every one of us. I completely agree with Ms. Doncho that we should all be so fortunate to have an advocate like you, and your deeply personal story of your mom and how you've told it certainly has impacted us and has undoubtedly helped many other families in a similar situation. Ms. Majowski, sorry if I butchered your name. You're probably aware that another parliamentary committee has recently completed a study with respect to elder abuse. It is something that has the attention of parliamentarians, and due in no small part because of the advocacy of you and the rest in that sphere. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Please know that it's making a difference, and we very much appreciate you being with us here today. Colleagues, we're going to suspend while we bid adieu to these witnesses and check for the next witnesses to come. So we're suspended for a couple of minutes. Order. Today, the committee is meeting on its study of the impact of COVID-19 on seniors. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses. When you are ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. Interpretation is available in this video conference. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Les services d'interprétation.
The interpretation services are available on this video conference. At the bottom of your screen, you may choose between floor, English, or French. When you speak, please speak slowly and clearly. And when you are not speaking, please mute your microphone.
Welcome our witnesses to continue our discussion with 5 minutes of opening remarks followed by questions. We have with us today from the Canadian Men's Shed Association, Doug Mackey, the chair du Conseil régional de...
And from the Conseil régional de développement social des Laurentides, we have Violaine Guérin, coordinator.
We will start with Mr. Mackey for 5 minutes, and after that sound check, I'm really looking forward to this. Mr. Mackey, you have the floor.
Do I have to start off with a joke, or is that okay? No. Canadian Men's Shed Association. Thank you for the opportunity to be a witness today. Men's Sheds is a volunteer-based organization of currently 39 sheds or groups of men in Canada, part of a worldwide movement of over 2,200 sheds located in Australia, New Zealand, UK, Ireland, USA, Kenya, Iceland, and other countries, as well as Canada. Men's Sheds opened in North America in 2010 here in Winnipeg. A Men's Shed is a unique volunteer grassroots organization run by men for men. The activities and projects are determined by the men themselves within the sheds, not from a central office. The main goal of a Men's Shed is to offer a safe, convenient place for men to gather, socialize, enjoy camaraderie, and as well participate in individual projects or group projects while working shoulder to shoulder. When a man retires, he loses structure in his life, may leave his most important social contacts at work, and loses meaning in his life. Seniors do not fill the gap. Most senior centers membership is 80% women, 20% men. Men can be hesitant to seek help. There are no other programs in Canada just for men, run by men. Men's Sheds combats loneliness, isolation, anxiety, and depression in men. Men's Sheds is not a self-help group. Canadian Men's Sheds Association receives no federal funding or even provincial funding unless it's on a sporadic basis. This is very much unlike the Men's Shed programs in the UK, Ireland, and Australia. The benefit of a Men's Shed is the improved emotional well-being or mental health of the men involved, thus improving the lives of the men, their families, and the communities in which they live. This is respectfully submitted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mackey.
And now, Ms. Guérin, you have 5 minutes, please. Yes. So the CRDSL has the mission to support the capacity of collective action in social development in the Laurentian region. Its members come from various sectors that work with vulnerable people, including seniors. In the context of the pandemic, the measures that have arisen have had a profound impact on the mental health of seniors, with an increase in psychological problems, including depression, anxiety, sleep problems, and post-traumatic stress. It is likely that the impacts on psychological health and physical health of seniors is likely to continue well beyond the context of the pandemic and the period in which physical distancing conditions will be maintained. In order to minimize the negative impacts, it will be important to ensure that policies concerning visits to residential facilities, hospitals, and hospices deal with the concern for a balance between the need to protect others and the fact that residents need to see their families and to have social relations. It would also be appropriate to study and review the conditions of participation of seniors at the national level in order to strengthen their participation in decision-making and in developing the policies that concern them. Social participation is a factor that protects the health of seniors and is connected with cognitive functions that are higher in the case of those who practice it, whereas social distancing measures seek to protect the health of vulnerable populations. Those same measures have a secondary effect of social isolation that leads to deterioration of the mental and physical health and cognitive abilities. Seniors perceive themselves to be isolated during the pandemic and tended to adopt unfavorable behaviors. Also, the interruption of many community services and visits to their homes during the pandemic had a significant impact on the health of seniors who depend on those services. The pandemic also generated an increase in ageist discourse and discrimination against seniors. This type of discourse strengthens a preconceived concept of seniors as being vulnerable and that their lives are of less value than those of younger people. There's also a form of mistreatment where the social identity of seniors is undermined and identified as a homogeneous group, which increases their susceptibility to discrimination and exclusion of our population, and also reduces their resilience in a crisis situation and can cause a number of societal consequences by contributing, among other things, to discrimination against older workers and retirees who return to the labor market after the pandemic. The ageist messages can be internalized and cause negative impacts such as a loss of self-esteem and of usefulness for society. So it would be relevant to use appropriate language to describe seniors that does not stigmatize them and to avoid stereotypes, avoid labeling seniors as uniformly fragile and vulnerable. Also, avoid using words to designate seniors that have negative connotations or that carry prejudice. Therefore, we should encourage intergenerational exchange in order to increase solidarity between generations and fight against prejudice, and develop awareness-building campaigns to fight against ageism. Fraud and abuse in all its forms have increased during the pandemic. Seniors have been targeted in a context where they're vulnerable and more susceptible to anxiety. It would therefore be important to equip them appropriately so that they can all be as well informed as possible on the different scams and frauds that they might be victimized by. It would therefore be appropriate to strengthen prevention and protection services for seniors against any form of violence, abuse, and fraud. Also, inform, educate, sensitize, and equip seniors so that they may be aware that these things exist. The pandemic, with its challenges, has forced us to adapt quickly with new technologies. However, using the virtual platforms has caused us seniors to be placed at a lower level because of the digital literacy that can be lower, and they participate less in virtual platforms in the context of the pandemic, and it excludes these people because it includes seniors that have a low income, that have lower levels of education, and also those that have a disfavorable or an unfavorable health situation. The situation has amplified the digital division, particularly for seniors living in rural areas where there's a lack of access to internet, and for more vulnerable seniors who do not have the financial means to buy the necessary technological equipment. Therefore, it would be appropriate to assist seniors and those who take care of them so that they can have access to digital communications tools or other ways of keeping in contact with their families and their social networks when physical displacement is limited, and also enable seniors to participate in learning programs, lifelong learning programs, and improve their access to information and communication technologies. This is nothing new. Seniors wish to stay home as long as they can. The events that we experienced during the pandemic, with a high number of deaths in different seniors' residences, reinforced this desire of seniors to stay in their own homes. So governments should work together for concrete solutions to foster the possibility for seniors to stay in their own homes. In-home services should be more accessible so that this can be done in the best possible conditions. Also, the shortage of affordable housing that is adaptable and accessible is a problem that only increases, thereby causing seniors to delocalize and to move closer to larger cities in order to have access to less expensive residences closer to services. Therefore, we should increase mobility services to guarantee that those who are more isolated can be closer to where they can get their needs taken care of, and also provide adequate care to seniors, such as mental health services, palliative care, and geriatric care, in particular by supporting the natural caregivers who are unpaid, who provide care in the home and in the communities, as well as paid social workers who provide in-home care or care in the institutions. Also ensure that community services are maintained, as well as care or assistance to elders, including social services and legal services in spite of physical distancing. Recognize the crucial role of natural caregivers and enable them to play that role with the necessary tools. Implement programs that foster support for staying at home. Build more community housing that is affordable and accessible to seniors to keep them in their living environment in a safe environment. In the Laurentian, 6.3% of seniors aged 65 and over live below the low-income threshold, according to the consumption basket measurement, which represents 5,930 individuals in a precarious situation. It is important to develop expertise and vigilance on the living conditions and employment conditions of those aged 55 and over, while evaluating the coverage of essential needs and getting them out of poverty after they retire. It is necessary to prioritize the effective realization of rights to quality of life for everyone when retiring as well as throughout their lifetime. Social participation of seniors no longer needs to be demonstrated. Of course, the aging population causes a number of challenges. Ms. Guerin, are you near the end? Yes, this is my conclusion. However, it is important to measure the social impact of seniors in the community. The volunteering, mentorship, helping people close to them, grandparents, the art lovers, tourism, consumers, in the same way as the rest of the population. Protecting human rights of seniors and of their situation is not taken into account enough in national programs and policies. The recovery after COVID has to be used to make a more inclusive society that's fairer and respectful of age, anchored in human rights with the objective of no longer leaving anyone out. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Guerin.
Starting with Mr. Morantz for 6 minutes. Welcome to the committee, sir. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's nice to be here. Hi, Doug.
Hi, Marty.
Hi. Doug, just for purposes of disclosure, is actually a constituent of mine. But more than that, he's he's a great jokester, and but more than that, he's a great Manitoban. I first met Doug back when I was in Winnipeg City Council a few years ago. He came to present in committee, and I'd never heard of Mensheds, but since then I visited Mensheds a number of times, and it does amazing work and really deserves the attention of this committee. In fact, I've said, Doug, if my political career ever comes to an abrupt or voluntary end, I may seek membership in the Menshed if they'll have me. But we'll cross that bridge at someday, I suppose. Doug, I wanted to give you a chance to speak a little bit more about Mensheds, and so the committee gets an idea as to exactly what happens there. I know when I visited, men were carving canes out of tree branches. They were doing woodworking, working with glass, doing all kinds of arts and crafts and things like that. I wonder if you could describe, well, there you go. There's a piece of the work right there.
Yes, Marty, thanks very much. Men sheds communicate differently than women do, and they communicate differently when they are virtually alone instead of within a group of mixed people. And quite often a man starts off his communication with his arms across his chest, protecting himself. And so what Mensheds offers is a open area where people can come and get to learn to know each other. Why were they doing, these are comfort birds, by the way, and they're given to palliative care patients. They fit beautifully in your hand. And one of our men made 150 of them and donated them to a person working with people in palliative care. But you give a man something to do, whether it's a bigger project or a small project, and he'll sit there and he'll do his work, and you start looking at the man beside him or the other side and watching what they're doing. And then, believe it or not, they open up. Who are you? What did you do? What's your family? How are you feeling? What are you doing going on? And I can relate very personal stories about how men, because they're doing things together, shoulder to shoulder, and not a plan or project or program that is dedicated just to them, but an open kind of thing, gives men an opportunity to sit back, relax, and start to communicate. And that's one of the questions or problems that people say, men don't communicate. Yes, they do, under the proper circumstances.
Yeah, and I've seen it firsthand. It really is a great environment, particularly for men who are widowed and retired and alone, but even more exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. And I'm just wondering, have you been able to have meetings virtually at all, or have they been? How have you coped?
That's an interesting comment. What I found is that Mensheds that are within a good community, and it could be Squamish, it could be Vanderhoof, BC, it can be Elmont, Ontario, it can be, those men get together, and we've been having a number of Zoom meetings. At one stage of the game, I think I was on 5 or 6 a week, listening to men from all over, but interestingly enough, also with a Menshed in Ireland. and another situation with the UK men's sheds, where Zoom has allowed us to meet and greet and establish relationships both locally here in Canada and elsewhere on an international basis.
And how many are there in Canada right now?
At this moment, there's 39 and about 1,200 men involved.
Yeah. And you established the first one right in here in Winnipeg, correct?
Yes, my daughter in Saskatoon learned about men's sheds, phoned me up, told me to go on a site in Australia, and I looked at it and said, "Oh, that's interesting." And she said, "Good, start one."
Now, while I've got you, because my time is limited, I wanted to touch on, I know that you said that other countries that have men's sheds, there are federal supports in Ireland, Australia, the UK, and so forth. What would men's sheds like to see from the federal government? I know you've tried to apply for charitable status a number of times. I wonder if you could talk about that and the other kinds of supports that you think might be necessary from a federal perspective.
Because of men's sheds and sort of what the bottom line is, which is mental health, I understand that we have 14 different jurisdictions here in Canada. And some of you say, no, Doug, there's 10 provinces and 3 territories, but also will you throw in the Aboriginal National Health Program, the 14th one. Under those conditions, it's a very difficult situation to try and get provinces, as you people know, to all cooperate and come up with an individual program. However, I think that there is an advantage if there was a small national office to become an advocate on behalf of all the provinces. And as we form more and more provincial-based organizations, to be able to take the challenges and the opportunities to people such as you.
Now, if I have time, Mr. Chair, I just want one quick last question. And I think the most important question right now for Mr. Mackey is, for anyone watching, how do they join MedSheds? How do they get involved?
There is a website, a national website, and they can go on there. And anyone who inquires, it ends up in my emails. I immediately get hold of them and try and pick up the telephone and call them or do a Zoom meeting with them. But it's a very simple operation. If 2 or 3 men get together and want to call themselves a men's shed, then we will accept them. There's no national cost. We like the New Zealand model, as a matter of fact, where they pay about $40 a year for each of their 120 sheds. The one other comment I'd like to make about this, Marty, is that we have different sort of social get-togethers here in Canada compared, but Ireland, which could fit into the bottom half of Manitoba, only has about 450 sheds. So, yes.
Well, we have a lot of work to do, clearly.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Moritz, and thank you, Mr. Mackey.
Thank you, Doug.
Next, Mr. Dong, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And Mr. Mackey, I did really enjoy your jokes in the beginning. I took notes. I'm going to share with my kids, and we're going to have a laugh. And thank you very much for telling the committee a bit more about men's shed projects. I know some men's shed projects across the country has received New Horizons Senior Program fundings, and also the special COVID-19 additional funding that was announced and implemented, which is worth, I believe, was $20 million. It's very important to support projects like this, because you're right. Like, it's, the sort of a belief in the society that the men having trouble to express how they feel or seek help when they face mental health challenges, and we know mental health challenges may lead to serious physical harm. And by a report by CAMH, I remember that I think it was over 75% of serious physical harm involve men. So, in your opinion, how these projects or peer support groups can combat stigma around mental health, especially when it comes to men in Canada?
Thanks, Mr. Dong, for your question. Your first comment about New Horizons for seniors, it doesn't work on a national basis. Any project that other than the one project, the big project, every 5 years. But I have a New Horizons for Seniors grant, which ends at the end of this month. And there are no men's sheds in Saskatchewan. I cannot take any of the money, which I have, and I will expend it all, but I cannot go to Saskatchewan and help them and open up a men's shed, because New Horizons for Seniors is provincially mandated down to one province. It does not go across provinces. And with our kind of situation, I need some funding, I think, to be able to go across provinces. The second thing about New Horizons for Seniors, and I'd like all of you to look at the New Horizons for Seniors priority number 3. And why do I say number 3? I'm going to read only part of it, but it says combating ageism, celebrating diversity, and promoting inclusion. And it says, particularly members of underrepresented or underserved groups, including but not limited to women, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, members of racialized and newcomer groups, and members of the LGBTQ2+ communities. I want you to note that there is no place that I can find within New Horizons for Seniors any mention of programs or opportunities for men.
I see.
Period.
And I appreciate that input. And then you mentioned about different levels of government need to work together to provide that support. In your opinion, how does that look like in terms of creating more maybe outreach initiatives from the government to support peer-to-peer support groups?
Well, again, it's interesting because we started men's sheds here in Winnipeg. It's now spread throughout BC, somewhat around Alberta, but there's nowhere east of Montreal. And how do we start supporting? How do I, as an individual, I live on a fixed income, I'm 80 years old, but how do I reach out to those people or get a program to those people, those men's sheds or possible groups of men in other communities? It's virtually, well, it's time consuming and it's a process, and I certainly have enjoyed it over the years. The challenge, it gets me up in the morning, but if there was funding which would allow men's sheds to do their outreach outside of an individual province, that would be of assistance. Okay. If there was potential funding, and we'd have to be careful here, for a sort of one-person advocate or manager on a national level, I think that has some merit. But we also need to try and help and work with Canadian Mental Health Association wherever we can. And it's interesting, the CMHA does have different priorities depending where they are. And recently I gave a Zoom meeting instruction on how to open up a men's shed to the rural part of the Alberta Canadian Mental Health Association.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Chair. Do I have more time for one question? Okay, good.
Yeah, you have just under a minute.
Okay. Quick question to Madame Guerin. In your work, have you noticed any challenges that seniors face in terms of accessibility? Because to keep them active and socially connected, accessibility is very, very important.
Yes, as a matter of fact, this is a problem that we often see pretty well everywhere. Transportation in the Laurentians, it's a region where there are many rural areas, and in particular for transportation and for public transit or adapted transit, there are a lot of problems that isolate seniors, and with regard to accessibility of housing too, because there's really a shortage of housing that is accessible or affordable, or accessible and adapted to the needs of seniors over the years, because one can enter a home when one is autonomous, but one may also change toward a loss of autonomy. And then there are issues that arise with regard to being able to stay in one's own home then, because there are not sufficient services, and the surroundings where one lives can cause us to have to change to another institution or environment, and also causes social separations from seniors who have to move away when they lose their autonomy. So there's a lot of work to be done in the area of accessibility of housing, too, to be considered at different levels. Thank you, Ms. Guérin.
Suite Madame Chabot pour
And Ms. Chabot for 6 minutes, please. Yes, thank you very much. To our witnesses, thank you for your testimony. Ms. Guérin, hello, greetings, thank you for your work and for your testimony and for all the work that you have done as a coordinator at the Regional Council of Social Development of the Laurentians. We see the importance of those councils, the CRDSL in Quebec. Thank you very much, bravo. Your testimony was very broad in scope. You were able to describe many things at the social and economic level and in terms of employment, and in particular, the contribution of seniors in our society. I'm not sure from what angle I'm going to approach the questions, but being responsible for the labor file, there is a question that comes to mind in your testimony. You talked about the losses of jobs of senior people when they're returning to work. And your brief mentions that in 2008, those 72 and over were most liable to not find a job after they had been placed on unemployment, and that they may face negative stereotypes connected to their age, taking into account their return to work. So do you think that that situation will continue? Because this is a problem. We know that there are people aged over 60 sometimes that work also to fulfill their needs. Or is there a particular kind of work we need to do to ensure that there's no discrimination in that regard? Well, as a matter of fact, we could answer that question from several different angles because, in fact, seniors do not always return to the labor market out of choice or out of a desire to, but rather out of need because their retirement pension is not sufficient to be able to take care of their basic needs. And that's an initial issue. And then as concerns the stigmatization of seniors in the labor market, it's true. I think that it's a situation that will continue to persist and has been amplified by the pandemic. And seniors have been categorized as part of a more vulnerable population in the framework of the pandemic that we've been through, which causes employers or reduce the number of experienced people hired by employers, even if there are programs that encourage employers to hire experienced workers with financial incentives and so on. It's not enough to stimulate employers to want to do so if they think that it's a higher cost to them and that there is a risk connected to it also. So I feel that it's an issue that is not going to disappear in the coming months and years. And I think it's a file that we need to work on seriously because with the increasing lifespan, there will be more and more workers who are older and will remain on the labor market. So we really need to take that into account.
Pardon.
Excuse me. Well, you're no doubt aware anyway that I'm with the Bloc Québécois, but we're particularly concerned about the financial situation of seniors without wanting to stigmatize them. We know that there's been an impoverishment, and the pandemic increased costs for groceries, for housing, for medication. And there are some seniors who are also natural caregivers, so it increases the cost of travel and so on. So as you know, the government has decided to assist seniors with the old age security pension, but starting at 75. So for us, it would appear to us to be fairer to have it apply as of the age of 65 to support all seniors. So what do you think about that situation? As a matter of fact, there are a number of factors that can result in a person not being able to work up until age 75. So they will have a decrease of income sooner than that. And as you mentioned very clearly, there are a number of seniors that have to leave the labor market, not out of choice, once again, but because they become natural caregivers. They have to take care of their spouse or another close relative. So then they have to suffer substantial loss of income. And clearly, with financial compensation that would be coming in as of 65, that would fulfill the needs of a larger proportion of the population, indeed, for sure. As regards affordable housing, you made a considerable study in our region, the Laurentians, but with regard to seniors, in particular, how to adapt housing and all that, how to make it affordable. We know that after a number of years now, the federal government has a program, a rapid housing program, a national housing strategy. In spite of everything, in Quebec, some municipalities say it's not enough, but you believe in the need to reinforce those measures to respond to housing needs, and to what degree are they glaring? A brief answer, please, Ms. Guérin. Yes, as a matter of fact, we are experiencing a very concerning situation now with regard to housing, pretty well throughout Quebec. But as regards housing for seniors, there's a lot of community-based housing that is built for people who are autonomous or semi-autonomous, and this housing is not adaptable for people losing their autonomy, and it's a problem, as I mentioned earlier, because it causes them to have to leave their home and to have to move to another location. So there's a loss of some social ties there, and it becomes more and more difficult to fulfill that with age. The more people age, the less they can adapt to certain types of change. So it does have impacts both physically and at the cognitive and mental level. So it is, as a matter of fact, it's true that the need for that is quite important for seniors, and it is a particular issue, yes. Thank you.
6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I'd like to welcome fellow Manitoban, Mr. Mackey, to the committee today. And I have some questions for Madame Guérin. Just expanding on affordable, accessible social housing. I know my riding of Winnipeg Centre, we have many seniors that are on the verge of being unsheltered. A real threat, a real reality as a result of not being able to afford housing. Can you speak a bit more about the importance of affordable, accessible social housing as one of the most important social determinants of health?
Effectivement, le logement.
As a matter of fact, housing is part of the social determinants of health. It is a right that ought to be acquired and accessible to everyone. And as a matter of fact, right now we're experiencing a situation that is very worrisome and problematic, with increases in the cost of housing that is out of control pretty well everywhere in Quebec. In fact, we ought to bring in measures to be able to slow down this rising in the cost of housing, because with regard to retirement homes and seniors' homes, those amounts remain fixed, but the cost of housing, well, the cost of Hydro-Quebec and groceries and so on only can increase, which causes the most vulnerable populations to become even more vulnerable and possibly to be considerably under the poverty threshold. And as regards affordable housing, it is in fact something that is significant and very important, but I would say all the more so, as I said earlier, adaptability and accessibility is not everything just to have affordable housing, but also the housing has to be adaptable and accessible for our seniors. And one of the solutions that could be very appropriate is to set up community structures with services on site so that care can be provided to seniors and enable an improvement in their state of health and greater autonomy or if they lose autonomy, that have care provided in the same setting where they live so that they can end their days in the same location. These would be beneficial solutions to consider.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you shared, particularly around choice. I know that we've had a lot of witnesses come to committee and talk about, widening options so seniors can choose if they want to be at home, if they want to be in a long-term care facility, so that we open things up so people actually have choice. I think that really is important for people to maintain their own dignity and independence, particularly as we age, particularly for women. So in saying that, speaking about women, we know that women, as they age, are live disproportionately at higher levels of poverty than we find with men. Not being eligible for pensions, for example, having their work as care work, which is often not paid. How has poverty disproportionately impacted seniors during the pandemic?
J'aurais pas vraiment d'éléments.
I don't really have any information to answer that question, but as a matter of fact, often women have a lower level of education and have often worked in invisible work by staying home and raising their children. So they are entitled to lower retirement pensions, if any. And this is indeed an issue for women. And there are many people who are isolated and living alone as well in Quebec, increasingly so, living alone in their home, and they don't necessarily have access to all the health care that they might benefit from, which also gives rise to a whole issue concerning the mental and physical health that can deteriorate. So there's a whole issue connected with access to in-home care and the ability to identify the more vulnerable people in society.
Just to follow up with that, can you speak, because of that, one of the things that I've been pushing for is a guaranteed livable basic income. Can you speak about the importance of ensuring all seniors have a livable income?
As a matter of fact, yes, I agree with that.
Add on that, on the importance of having a livable income?
Well, indeed, it would enable everyone to make the same choices, have the same opportunities. It would make it possible to limit social inequalities, and it would make it possible to ensure that all seniors can have the right to social activities, to be able to go out of the home, to be able to afford transportation to go and buy groceries, or have the means needed to go to the movies if they want to do so. Because indeed, there are a number of seniors who cannot afford to participate in certain cultural or social activities because they have an insufficient income to do that, and their income is barely enough to deal with their basic essential needs, such as shelter, food, and clothing. It's pretty well limited to that. And when they have the opportunity to buy some food and clothes, fortunately, there are community organizations that are there if they can't, so that provides a social safety net that is significant in our society, that makes it possible to support the most vulnerable people and enable them to maintain a certain level of quality of life. But indeed, it would be necessary for incomes to be made more equal in order to reduce social inequalities. Thank you, Ms. Guérin.
Next, Ms. Dancho, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. My first question is for Mr. Mackey. Thank you for being here. My understanding is your organization provides, and please correct me, provides support for senior men, kind of comes together almost a fraternity style with the friendship, support, like similar interests to kind of help senior men, cope with the issues they deal with? Is that?
Yes, it is. I'd like to make one comment on the last speech. I have a homeless son here in Winnipeg, living in a shelter. And if you want to get really personal, I can tell you some stories. Anyway, yes. Also, a comment on I'll come back. Yeah,
sure.
What Men's Sheds does is offers a place for something we call health by stealth. And health by stealth is not where you have an arranged total program on whatever, but we bring in speakers. We may bring in someone on Alzheimer's, we may bring in someone on stroke recovery, or whatever, and ask someone to speak about it to the men. And it's interesting because if a man and his spouse or partner were to go to a public meeting, quite often the man sits there with his arm across his chest, doesn't ask any questions, he doesn't want to reveal it, but you get a group of men working together, trying to learn something together, then they will come and listen to a speaker on all nutrition, on Ducks Unlimited, on stroke recovery, and all of these kinds of things. Okay. The second part of it is that we go back to those organizations, and it can be mental health, can be occupational therapists, and we ask them to socially prescribe to men's sheds. And if you're not familiar with social prescribing, please look it up. But they refer men, medical people refer men to us.
And so how would you say, Mr. Mackey, how would you say that your efforts to support men in your community with this program have been impacted? I know you've outlined it a little bit, but have you felt that it's been quite detrimental, and what have the impacts of that been? Because it sounds like you kind of gather in a group, right, and socialize and have that camaraderie, I would imagine, is quite important to that model of service delivery. How has that been impacted by the measures, and how do you feel that we can best move forward?
Well, we're trying to prepare for that right now as we go along. But yes, virtually every men's shed has closed down. They can't get together as a group. And we've been in lockdown in Manitoba since about the 7th of November. And it's been all the men's sheds have closed. The unfortunate situation is some of the locations where we used to open up and run a men's shed may not be available to us as we come out. Reason being, costs, or suddenly they've now gone into debt, and they're going to start saying to us, you got to pay us $200 a month, and we don't have the money. Interestingly enough, on the sideline, we raise money by tool garage sales.
Oh, that's very innovative.
We collect tools, and I got one email this morning saying, do you want a chop saw? Do you want a radial arm saw? Do you want 2 or 3 things? And I literally know who the man is, and so I'll pick those up in the next little while, and we'll store those items and a tool garage sale. Now that has much further implications than simply, they raised some money in a garage sale. It's fascinating because quite often younger people will come to that tool garage sale and start to learn to use those tools, or they say, how do you use this? And
so
one of the men will mentor them.
Generational handyman knowledge from the senior men to the younger men and women who are interested in that.
That was I'm going to say, and it's always fascinating for me to watch the younger women that come in and say, I want to buy that tool. I'll learn how to do it. Where do I go, and what do I do?
That's wonderful.
It's yes.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. When I went off to university many years ago, the gift my father got me as a parting gift was a toolbox. I actually used it quite a bit. So I know my grandfather had taught me many things when he was around. So I really appreciate the generational knowledge that you're also providing. And I can imagine that there's many opportunities with the shed model to bring in younger, perhaps troubled men or what have you, to have that knowledge and that transfer from our senior men. And I just want to thank you for what you're doing. And I hope that your organization can fully recover when we come out of this pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Mackey.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Doncho. Next, Mr. Vaughn, please, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, and to Madame Garand. I was curious about your observations vis-a-vis accessible housing and isolation. Obviously, during COVID, when people were asked to stay home, people without accessible housing, in particular seniors, you may be able to navigate the stairs once or twice a day very carefully, but if you forget your glasses or need something from downstairs or upstairs, accessibility becomes a limiting factor if we don't build accessible housing. Are the programs sufficient in terms of the delivery of accessible housing in Quebec right now?
No, I would say that the programs are not sufficient. We would need to have an increase in the programming in order to build more housing that is accessible for seniors, of course.
One of the characteristics of the national strategy, which is the federal funding that flows through Quebec City to the province, is a federal requirement that 25% of all new affordable housing be built to universal design to allow people with disabilities, but also people to age in place. Is that a program that you would support? Is that a federal standard that you would support at the provincial level? Is 25% of all new social housing was built to that standard?
Well, it's hard to pronounce myself on a percentage. I'm not sure if it would be enough, in the sense that we know that we're going to be facing an aging population in Quebec and in Canada. So increasingly, more and more seniors are going to be part of our community. And I think that we need to look forward and anticipate the situation rather than end up in a situation that will cause a problem in the coming years. I know that if we project into the future, 20 or 30 years, we're going to have a very strong increase in the number of seniors in the population. And we need to anticipate, and as of today, we need to plan for new accessible housing for those people with the services that go along with it too.
So you would support the federal position, which is that accessible housing should be mandated to be part of any new public housing program. Otherwise, it gets built without those.
Oui, définitivement.
Yes, definitely.
Federal requirements can help advance the needs of the people of Quebec without necessarily being agreed to or not agreed to by the province of Quebec.
Oui.
Yes.
In terms of how affordable housing is delivered, one of the other components of the national housing strategy is rent support. We know that as people age in place, and as people particularly with disabilities age in place, there are additional costs attached to. You spoke about basic income before, but there are additional costs that model around the person's life as opposed to just simply turning 65 and getting a check. That disability, as well as age, as well as gender, are all intersectional realities that create different costs of living for different people. Is it a single system of paying everyone the same, or do we need to pick up and pay for the exceptionalities which differentiate one particular age population as opposed to another? In other words, do we need to fit the programs around people, or do we need to fit people into the programs? And as we see COVID take root, how critical is it being to make sure that we attend to the individual needs of people, not just treat them as over 65 and that's that?
The danger of focusing on individual needs is that we'll end up increasing social inequalities. I think that if we base it strictly on specific issues, we'll certainly leave out certain categories of the population that will not be able to benefit from certain programs because the requirements to be able to benefit from it will be too strict and limiting. So I think that it would be worthwhile to have an equal income for everyone, a guaranteed equal income for everybody, perhaps with the possibility of additional subsidies for certain specific problems such as handicaps in particular. But I feel that what's preferable would be to unify, to pull together the basic amounts so that we end up with a more inclusive society with much less social inequality.
Ron, suite Madame Chabot pour.
Ms. Chabot for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Ms. Guérin. I would like to ask you an open question to give you time. I really appreciated your referral to human rights in your testimony that included issues of isolation, mental health, psychology, affordable housing, and dignity and poverty and equality. And when you say that our analysis grid ought to be based on human rights, I would like you to talk about that, please.
Mais effectivement, je pense que
As a matter of fact, at any stage in our life, everyone ought to have the same rights. So I could change the angle a bit when I talk about seniors, when we talk about the possibility of continuing school for our youth during the pandemic, and we saw that the most vulnerable people did not have access to computers to be able to take their courses remotely. And right from there, we could see how there could be social inequalities right from a young age. And I think it's important for us to try to include in our concerns and the programs that we reflect on already, to include people more in our reflection process, to develop programs by reflecting together with the people involved who experience those situations in particular. I think that would put us in a much better position to respond to their needs and to find strategies and adequate strategies to fulfill the real needs of the population. So I think that's one first thing that we could do, is to include those people more in the reflection process concerning them, including seniors as well as young people, or people who are the victims of spousal violence or victims of homelessness, and include them in our reflection process. I think that's essential in order to be able to build programs that really respond to the true needs of the community. And then after that, yes, as a matter of fact, everyone ought to have the same rights. Everyone should be able to benefit from clean, healthy housing in good conditions. Everyone ought to be able to have healthy food, not just products that come from a food donation system that are not all that fresh or high quality. There are a lot of seniors who go around to the food counters where they can be given food because they can't afford to buy the groceries, and we have to take all those things into consideration in the future for our programs in order to put together a Quebec and a Canada that is fairer and more inclusive. Thank you, Ms. Guérin.
The last person to pose questions today will be Ms. Gazan, please, for 2.5 minutes. Ms.
Thank
Gazan.
you so much, Chair. My question is for Mr. Mackey. You spoke a lot about conditions of social isolation and impacts of social isolation during the pandemic. How does your organization assist with combating social isolation for seniors?
I think you've made an assumption here that we have a top-down organization. We do not. We have a bottom-up grassroots organization. So each men's shed, wherever it is, has been out looking after their own, within their own community. And whether you take Neepawa, Manitoba, or whether you take Altona, these men quite often are keeping in touch by Zoom or talking to each other on the phone. And that's what we have encouraged. But because we're not top down, we do not impose programs onto anyone. It's up to the individual shed. And many of them have done a great job in that.
Do you think it would be helpful, like one of the things that we've discussed a lot in committee is the importance of technology, especially during the pandemic, where people couldn't meet in person. Would it be helpful to get support for participants so that they can participate should they have, for example, issues with accessing internet or computers?
Excuse me for 1 minute, colleagues. The bells are ringing in the House. Therefore, we require the unanimous consent to continue. Ms. Gazan actually only has about another minute to go, so I don't think it's much of an imposition. Are we okay just to finish up this round, then we'll adjourn? Thank you. Ms. Gazan, go ahead.
Yeah, so just building on that. Thank you.
That's an excellent idea. Again, I can hardly wait for the COVID to be allowing us to meet again and then bring in more technical people and show people how to actually do some of these kinds of things. I personally teach Zooming. And whenever I can, I get hold of someone, I set up, first of all, I telephone them, and then I'll set up how to download Zoom onto your machine. Then I have them do that. And then the next thing I do is I set up an individual Zoom meeting with that particular man, and then have him gain confidence. Many times the technical aspects of computers are simply the confidence of older men who sometimes feel that they should know it all or they're not going to ask questions. And so, yes, any way that we can expand their confidence in using computers, etc., would be a help.
Thank you so
one
much.
Short and final question, if you want, Ms. Kazan.
Yes, sure. I'm going to send it to Madame Guerin. In terms of technology, you talked a little bit about social isolation. One of the things that I've been talking about is making any sort of technology, Wi-Fi, a public service. Would you agree that that would be helpful with seniors?
So the last word is yours, Ms. Guerin. Please be brief. Yes, indeed, I think it ought to be a service accessible free of charge everywhere. It would be indeed something that would enhance participation of seniors, particularly those who are most vulnerable, who don't necessarily have access to new technologies, as I mentioned earlier. It would foster inclusion of many people who don't have access to it, unfortunately, due to means.
I want to thank our witnesses for being with us. Thank you, Ms. Kazan. Mr. Mackey, you have a very effective way of capturing and keeping the attendance of your audience. I'm sure that's a big reason for the success of Men's Sheds. Madame Guerin, merci beaucoup.
Ms. Guerin, thank you very much for your testimony. It's clear that your knowledge is very broad, and we appreciate your work in the community and your presence here today.
That is a wrap for until the summer. I hope you're able to put your feet up and have a very relaxing and enjoyable summer, and look forward to seeing you all back here energized and ready to go in September. With that, can we just
give a 3 cheers to our chair, who has been gracious, organized, smart, helpful, and a good friend to all of us. And Sean, it's never easy to herd cats like MPs are herded at times, but you've done a heck of a job. I just want to thank you for all your assistance.
Thanks, especially Sean. When Adam's around.
Thank you. Very gracious. Do we have?
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, we stand adjourned.
Thank you, Sean.